much begins at the edge of your comfort zone. That statement is so profound. And yes, I do agree with that statement. Because without struggling and suffering, one cannot progress. One cannot do the introspection and determine what is required for one to move forward. So just to add on to that, it's almost as though adversity is required for one to make a change, because as human beings, we are naturally tending to be comfortable. We want to settle in a situation or an environment. And once a stimulus is applied to an environment that a person is involved in, the body adapts, just like in the case of running. For one to improve in running, one has to apply a stress to the body over and above what they're comfortable with in order for them to improve. And what happens in that process is adaptation. Your body adjusts and becomes stronger in order for you to face the circumstances that your body could be facing going forward. So I agree with that statement once again, that in order for one to progress, one has to step outside of what they're comfortable with. And nobody wants to stagnate, because if you're not growing, you are dying. Back to you.
So an apt title, inasmuch as you did simplify governance for us by using the analogy of a family, which, as I recall, was what you used in the first speech as well. And you said that it might be a subject that for many people induces boredom, and they'd rather watch paint dry. You then asked us to remember our choice about whether governance is important. And when you got to the end of the speech, you came back to that and wrapped it up nicely. It's always good to have a conclusion that refers back to the introduction. And in between, you gave us this analogy of the family, where parents are the directors, grandparents perhaps are the shareholders, children are the staff, and so on. There are ground rules, processes, policies, and the law. And as you go up the hierarchy, you get more authority delegated to you. I liked the Warren Buffett test. If it appeared in the newspaper, how would you feel? And it would be wonderful if more of our public officials would consider that test. Some points for improvement. It wasn't clear initially what kind of governance we're talking about. I think most of us who are not in the field ourselves think inevitably, because the words are so close, that governance refers to the government. Now, in this case, it's much wider, and I got the impression that you were focusing much more on corporate governance rather than necessarily governance within the government sphere. So that might be worth just pointing that out. In terms of your presentation, it was excellent. You had good framing in your camera. Your gestures were visible. That was very useful. And so I think a well-rounded speech for its level. Well done. And we look forward to your next one.
Good evening, Mr. President, fellow Toastmasters, and guests. Governance. What is it about this dreaded word that evokes such feeling of boredom, of bureaucratic? What is it about this word that makes it seem as if you would prefer to watch paint dry rather than hear anything concerning the word governance? Could it be, perhaps, that it is just construed as a tick box exercise? Now, I'm not sure about you, but often when I am presented with a survey and I have options, 4 simple options, yes, no, maybe, not sure. For some reason, that evokes a feeling of anxiety within me because I want to make the correct choice. So I would just like to ask you, do you think governance is important? Yes? No? Maybe? Not sure. I'd like you to keep that survey in your mind until we reach the end of this. So what I'm trying to do today is to try and attempt to bring governance to you as more realistic and more applicable to everyday life. And one of that is when we think of when we were children. We were all born into this world. Our parents had dreams. They had ambitions for us. They had desires of who we will become, what we will become. And it's the same with a company. So when a company comes into existence, it has the same vision. It has a purpose. It has a mission. So let me take this analogy of you being the company and your family being your directors, your shareholders, your community. So for example, your parents are your directors, your grandparents are your shareholders, and your community are your stakeholders. All very important people in your life, and all very important people who play a role in the proper governance of a company, and who hold companies accountable for that. I'm sure you will recall that you had house rules growing up. I did. I often transgressed those and often faced the consequences. And the same is true for companies as well. Companies have processes, they have policies, and most importantly, they are required to act within the ambit of the law. Now, moving on with this analogy of family. Whereas you grew older into a young adult, your parents then granted you a bit of independence, obviously because you were now aware of what your limits were. They gave you responsibilities as well. The same can be said about the company. Executives, senior managers are all granted a sense of independence and authority by the board through what is called the process of decision-making called the Delegation of Authority. Now, this is only one document in the whole process of governance. But it's important to just understand why these documents are in place and why that decision-making process is in place. Ultimately, we all want to live an ethical and responsible life. And the same is true for companies. Although it may not appear so to many, there are companies who truly do want to act ethically and responsibly. Now, how do you act ethically? What is your marker? What is your ethical marker? For me, I use the Warren Buffett test that simply states, and I will paraphrase, that if an article had to appear in a newspaper where you made a decision or an action, and your family and your friends were privy to that newspaper, how would you feel about that decision or that action that you made? So in all our lives, we strive to always act ethically. That is what is in us, to try and act ethically. And the same is true for companies as well, because the consequences of unethical behavior result in serious reputational damage. And the same is true, board of directors, employees, all strive to have proper governance in place to try and mitigate any events of reputational damage. As a parent, you would never ask your child to ever undertake any ethical act. Any ethical act that may be against your family values. And it's the same moral framing that must be used for leaders of companies when cultivating a governance culture. It is up to the leaders to set that ethical culture. So I come back to my survey and I ask you, is governance important? Yes, no, maybe. And while it may be a dreaded word, I hope that you would in the future perhaps be receptive to its intention, and hopefully will make it onto the new buzzword, and hopefully will soon be the trending word on Instagram.